Lisa, thanks so very much for your kind introduction. It's a special privilege for Paul Neuhauser and I to present the Founders Awards tonight to the religious investors who launched ICCR and simultaneously created a new chapter of history both for religious investors and the business community. One of the challenges that you face when you are inviting two of your older members involved in this work and in ICCR from the beginning is that together Paul and I have about a century of stories to tell. Now that's if we could remember them all. But anyway, that means we would go on forever. So Lisa will be our stern timekeeper. Paul and I both were fortunate to be present at the creation, involved in the starting steps for ICCR and the launch of 5 decades plus of shareholder resolutions. I served as one of the first staff members of ICCR and its predecessor organization. And as Paul remembers well, the Episcopal Church created history when it filed a shareholder resolution in 1971 with General Motors, calling for their withdrawal from apartheid South Africa. I was privileged to attend that stockholders meeting when the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church put the resolution on the floor before 1,000 stockholders. It was a front page New York Times story. ICCR was created by its founders to share information and craft strategies, to build a path together and provide moral support to each other as we entered a brand new arena of work. Remember, there was no roadmap written at the time for investors engaging with companies, and company leaders were equally perplexed about how to deal with a new breed of investors raising moral and business ethics issues. Who would have guessed that the founders were giving birth to an organization, but also an investor movement still exploding in size and impact 50 years later? In the early days, as now, ICCR members held private dialogues with companies while also pursuing public campaigns and shareholder resolutions. But in those days, success was getting over 3% of the vote so a resolution could come back in another year. And we didn't even know for sure what success was if a company started responding positively for our request for information or changing policy. We learned as we went. But we can point to a real and concrete impact, even in those early days, as banks began to stop lending to the apartheid government of South Africa, or major copper companies were forced to abandon plans to strip mine a delicate region in Puerto Rico, or companies began to disclose diversity information. Or finally, when infant formula companies were forced to end irresponsible marketing practices promoting baby formula over breastfeeding in developing countries. And the significant list of impact by ICCR and its members goes on, cataloged so well on ICCR's website. You know, the founders had vision and patience, and they exercised the responsible use of economic power, taking on many issues that seemed impossible at that time, but were certainly the right thing to do. They deserve our applause as both prophetic and effective voices, helping create a new arena of corporate social responsibility, as it was called in the time. The founders included the American Baptist Home Mission Society, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, the Episcopal Church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the National Council of Churches, the Presbyterian Church USA, the United Church of Christ, and the United Methodist Church, led by United Methodist Women. And they were soon joined in the 1970s and 80s by numerous Roman Catholic orders, swelling our ranks and strengthening our effectiveness. And we all remember Mike Crosby, a spark plug of an organizer, introducing Roman Catholic investors to social investing to corporate responsibility, and bringing them to ICCR. But even as we grew, our ministry was also limited to being a prophetic voice outside company boardrooms, raising key issues that were usually not on board agendas for study or action. How things have changed. Jumping forward a half century, we see a very different world today as investors large and small raise scores of important ESG issues with companies. Investor voices now include huge pension funds, foundations, trade unions, individuals, and investment managers, as well as the religious community, have been a steady presence for 50 years. And most often, we work in tandem, in cooperation with each other. For example, we can note the growth of the Principles for Responsible Investing, PRI, a global investor coalition who together argues that sustainability is a necessity for long-term creation of shareholder value. PRI has approximately 4,000 members with assets under management of over $100 trillion. Who would have guessed that a critical mass of investors would now be interacting with companies on key ESG issues? The times, they are changing. And it is no longer a surprise to have a resolution receive a majority vote, or for multiple companies to reach out and engage with investors coming to agreements to expand transparency or change their policies or practices. And what a breath of fresh air to see the Securities Exchange Commission requiring companies to disclose critical ESG information, embracing this as necessary for investors to fulfill their fiduciary duty. This is validating decades of our work. But finally, at this moment, we face increasing pushback as well, with critics alleging that we're politicizing the investment process and promoting woke capitalism. The sustainability work companies are pursuing and investors are affirming still faces some significant roadblocks. Our leadership is needed as much as ever. But at this moment, let's simply pause and say thank you to the visionaries who created ICCR and helped launch a new era of corporate responsibility. And standing on their shoulders, let us thank the hundreds of ICCR members and allies who worked together to make the vision from 50 years ago a reality. Let the people say amen. Thank you.
It is a great pleasure and honor to accept the Founders Award on behalf of the Episcopal Church. Let me give you a bit of background on how we became one of the founders of ICCR. In the 60s, presiding Bishop John Hines, who deserves sainthood, led the church into a new era, following Christ more closely by actually paying attention to the deprived and oppressed. My own involvement began about 1960, when I was one of three persons, including Arthur Walmsley, who was then head of the social concerns for the church, and later became Bishop of Connecticut, drafted the church's response to the sit-in movements against segregation. Some years later, in 1970, Bishop Hines convinced the Executive Council, which is the governing board of the Episcopal Church, to establish a new committee, which is a new committee of the board, the Committee on Social Responsibility and Investments. That committee consisted of some members of the governing board and also some, like myself, who were not members of that body. The idea of social responsibility investments was quite controversial and was supported, as well as were some other of Bishop Hines' initiatives, by only about 60% of the governing board. Indeed, that division lasted for some time and still existed when I became a member of the governing board in 1976. The SRI committee was chaired by Bob Potter, a New York corporation lawyer, and we decided that our initial focus would be on discrimination, but especially on apartheid in South Africa. We decided that we would submit a shareholder proposal to General Motors, asking it to get out of South Africa, ceasing all operations as long as apartheid existed. I drafted the proposal, and the Executive Council approved it. General Motors did not want it on the proxy statement and requested a no action letter at the SEC. I defended the proposal at the SEC. As background, you should understand that the SEC at that point had excluded all proposals on so-called social issues, including having a few years earlier excluded a proposal to Greyhound asking for desegregation of Greyhound's buses. Our proposal at General Motors won at the SEC. Bishop Hines personally presented the proposal at the General Motors meeting in Cobo Hall in Detroit in May 1971. One of the GM directors came down from the podium and spoke passionately in favor of it. That was Leon Sullivan, after whom the Sullivan Principles to end segregation in the workplace of American corporations in South Africa was named. The Episcopal Committee undertook a second significant initiative at the end of 1970. The Bishop of Puerto Rico was concerned about a proposed copper mine to be opened on the island. We decided to challenge the proposed mine two ways. First, we submitted shareholder proposals to the owners of the proposed mine, namely Kennecott Copper and American Metal Climax. But in addition, we decided to hold open public hearings in Puerto Rico where opposition to the proposed mine could be expressed. The basis for this opposition was twofold. One, the impact on the environment, an environmental issue 52 years ago, and also impact on the indigenous population. The 50-page report prepared after the hearings can still be found on the internet. The crucial thing, however, was that Bob Potter persuaded 5 other denominations to join with us in holding those hearings. The Episcopal Church at those hearings was represented by Bob Potter and Father Ev Francis, who was Arthur Walmsley's successor at the National Church. The UCC by Richard Doobie, the Women's Division of the Methodist Church by Florence Little and Kim Jefferson, the American Baptist Home Mission Society by Horace Gale. They were joined at the hearings by the Presbyterian Church and the Lutheran Church in America, which is now the ECLA. ICC grew out of that coalition, again under the leadership of Bob Potter. Those denominations, together with the Disciples of Christ, represented by Wade Rubick, decided to continue to work together on corporate responsibility and to fund a newly created organization to do that joint work. Most of the core of the early leadership of ICCR were the individuals that I have just named. For instance, Horace Gale, treasurer of the American Baptist Home Mission Society, became the treasurer of ICCR. There were 2 additional strands that converged to form a strong and lasting ICCR. First of all, the National Council of Churches had an existing project called the Corporate Information Center, directed by Frank White. That project was merged into ICCR, with Frank becoming its first executive director. Tim, I think you became the second employee of ICCR, transitioning from your work elsewhere on South Africa. The final strand that made ICCR a strong organization that it is today was about 2 years later, when Roman Catholic organizations joined. I believe this was due entirely to the initiative of Mike Crosby, for the repose of whose soul I pray every week, who recruited numerous Roman Catholic institutions to join in what is undoubtedly the most outstanding example extant of Protestant and Roman cooperation, now enhanced by Jewish and Islamic participation as well. In the 50 years since its founding, many have labored fruitfully in the ICCR vineyard, but that vineyard would not exist except for the extraordinary vision of three people: John Hines, Bob Porter, and Mike Crosby. Thank you.